Truthiverse is officially sponsored by the Grow Network, founded by Marjorie Wildcraft, who is the female leader in the survival and preparedness space. With the food supply under attack worldwide and more uncertainty than ever, you may want to check out her free You Can Grow Food webinar. It'll show you how to grow loads of food as fast as possible, even if you have no experience, are older, or just plain out of shape. Check it out for free at brendansbackyard.com. Okay, so let's start from the start. So you are the author of Caesar's Messiah. Your basic thesis is something I'd really like to introduce people to. You talk about this Jesus-Moses typology, and you talk about the Titus thing as well. And I'd really like to sort of introduce people at a ground level to this and, see where we can take it. So, ladies and gents, this is Joseph Atwill, and you are probably a figure of a fair bit of controversy. I mean, you only just come onto my radar very recently, which is kind of annoying to me that I haven't known about you a lot earlier. But you must have generated a fair bit of controversy, and I've seen on your blog you've got these academics. What was his name, Carrier, who like to pick at your work and misrepresent it and all this kind of stuff. So. Yes, how did you end up in this? I think you mentioned briefly, but how can you take us back to the beginning of how you stumbled into this kind of this revelation that you've kind of been unfolding over the years?
Sure. Well, I developed an interest in sort of the history of Christianity. I went to school at a St. Mary's Military Academy in Tokyo, and so my early life was spent sort of by myself. We were one of the very first non-military families in the country, and so I didn't have any friends. So I was a reader. I read, and that's what I was able to do with my time. And obviously, catechism, the teaching of it was a Catholic school. Teaching about Jesus was sort of the main subject. So I was interested in that. And then later, I fell away from the faith. I'd been raised a Catholic, and for no particular reason, just things were more interesting. I just stopped participating and was doing other things. And later in life, though, I was still interested in Christianity. Specifically, I became interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Mm-hmm. And what was amazing to me was that they were describing a messianic movement, right? But one that was militaristic, the one that did not want to get along or, carry the Roman soldier's backpack or turn the other cheek. This was a xenophobic and militaristic outfit. And I could not understand how the two messianic movements, the one that is described in the Gospels and the one that the Dead Sea Scrolls describes, could get along together. I thought they would be at each other's throats, and yet there's no description of this movement in the Gospels. So to try to understand that, I read the Roman historian Josephus. This is the only individual that you can get any background on the era from. There's only one history of the region, and that comes through Josephus. And it was trying to understand sort of the, just the ethos of the era through Josephus that I noticed that there was a strange relationship between Josephus and the Gospels. And I saw a lot of the passages in Josephus as somehow mocking or having some kind of parallelism to events in the Gospels. And one day I had the only really original insight, which was that the parallels that I had been studying between Josephus and the Gospels were occurring in the same sequence. They were occurring in the same sequence in both works. And so this indicated to me that it wasn't just Josephus making fun of Christianity, which is what my original idea was, but rather I was dealing with something different than that, something broader. And I also realized through great effort that at the beginning of the Gospels, there is a typological, what I would call a primer. It's something that actually is supposed to, as it turns out, introduce people to the style of literature that the Gospels are written within. And even though I thought I had discovered this system, it is actually well known to scholarship. Goulder had written about it. in like the 1930s or something, so it's well understood by scholarship. And even though it just takes a bit of time, I'm just going to go through it because it's this little tiny system of typology. I mean, I'm only going to read like 8 different parallels, but if a listener can understand this, they will have all that they need to understand the rest of the gospel. And beyond that, much of modern literature is actually based upon this one way or another. So you're sort of in the dark and really understanding a lot of our literature without understanding how this simple typologic system operates. So basically, just to recap, at the beginning of the Gospels in Matthew, you have a story where Joseph, who is the father of Jesus, has dreams, and these cause him to go from Israel down to Egypt. I'll give the citation of the places just so people can easily find them. It's 2:13, 2:16. You have the massacre of the boys by Herod. 2:20, you have a divine person show up and he tells Joseph they are dead who sought the young child life. This leads to return from Egypt back to Israel. Then in Matthew 3:13, Jesus passes through water. It's his baptism. Then he goes into the wilderness for 40 days, right? And you have the temptations. You have quotations concerning tempted by bread, 4:4, do not tempt God, 4:7, and then worship only God, 4:10. So this is well known as the overview of the what can be called the pre-ministry of Jesus. All right, starts at the very beginning of the book, page 1 of Matthew, and goes through 4:10. Now, the entire story has been lifted, in other words, taken based upon the Old Testament. And you can see this if you actually stand back and look at the broad concepts. In Genesis 45:50, Joseph, dreamer of dreams, he goes from Israel down to Egypt. Exodus 1, the Pharaoh massacres the boy. Exodus 4, you have a verbatim quote that Matthew uses, all the men are dead who sought the child's life. Exodus 12, you'd have the same journey. You go from Egypt back to Israel. Exodus 14, you pass through water. You have the going through the Dead Sea bit with the Israelites escaping. I'll return to that at the conclusion because that's a very important parallel. But then you have the going into the wilderness, just as Jesus does, or actually Jesus is repeating the theme from the Old Testament. You go into the wilderness, but the Israelites go in there for 40 years. Notice that Jesus goes for 40 days. And you can see that the typology, the relationship is not verbatim. It's not verbatim. There's just enough information inside that the two stories are sharing so an alert reader can see that one is based on the other. But then there's the verbatim quotes that Matthew uses in the correct sequence. Exodus 16, the tempted by bread. Exodus 17, the instruction, do not tempt God, and then Exodus 32, worship only God. So what you got is locations, physical locations. You have concepts, right, like the passing through water. You have names, Joseph, and the wilderness. And then you have sequence. Okay, so it's occurring in the same sequence. Now, the sequence is very important. And this is something that is not well understood by both New Testament scholarship and literary scholarship in general. Sequence provides context and meaning to parallels that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise. And I'm referring specifically in this instance to the passing through water. I mean, if you just read the two parallels side by side, it would make no sense at all. I mean, the Israelites are a whole bunch of them, and it's not in the River Jordan. They don't actually get dunked in the water, it's just the opposite. On Jesus' side, he actually is dunked in water. It's at the River Jordan. So they're not very, very parallel. However, they do occur in the same point. And in Matthew, he makes sure that an alert reader understands that these events are linked because he takes a verbatim quote from the Exodus story and puts it into Jesus, right? He says, out of Egypt, I have called my son, right? Israelites are referred to as the Son of God, and Jesus, in God the Father, applies the same quote to Jesus. So he makes sure that an alert reader sees the system. Okay, so the whole theory in Caesar's Messiah is that that system, this system of typology, of parallel concepts, names, locations occurring in sequence, goes forward in time. The one I just gave is a way of representing Jesus Christ as the new Moses. Okay, so he has all these events from Exodus, from the old story, the old Moses, the old covenant, and Jesus is going to be the new covenant. So he's kind of representing that he is the founder, the person who intercedes between God and the followers of the religion. And so he's the new Moses. Okay, so that's what this system of typology does. It identifies, it has this link between Jesus and Moses. Now, when you go forward in the adult ministry, the same system is used. In other words, the author does not shift genres. He stays in this genre. And so when you go forward, you'll see that Jesus has parallels, but not going back to the Old Testament, but forward in time to the war between the Romans and the Jews. Okay, now this may seem odd, but you have to sort of remember that Jesus's prophecies are about the coming war with Rome, the war between the Jews and Rome. In other words, Jesus envisions Jerusalem being encircled. He envisions the temple being razed. He envisions the abominations of desolation. So these are events that occur 40 years later during the Roman-Jewish war. And so the parallels that make up this relationship between Jesus and the war, a great many of them have been seen by scholars. Mm-hmm. They're not hard to see. They're pretty vivid, but they've never noticed that they're occurring in the same sequence. They've always analyzed them as single parallels, and then they come up with some explanation for why the author of Matthew or Luke or Mark might have had some cause to be aware of something in Josephus, or, they have some explanation, but they never talk about this overall construction of Jesus's ministry as having been entirely developed, out of the Roman war. So that is, in a nutshell, the interpretive framework that I believe a reader is supposed to take into the Gospels. You just don't shift genres. You just stay in the typological genre, and you just go forward. And what this does, the purpose of this, is that Jesus envisions someone coming in 40 years. Okay, now I can show you how that the number is exactly 40, but it would take a bit of time. But in any case, it's 40 years in the future he's looking. He sees that, Jerusalem's going to be encircled, temple's going to get raised, not one stone atop another, the abomination of desolation. All of these events from the war are going to occur. And he indicates that this will occur when someone he refers to as the Son of Man arrives. So the Son of Man comes, the events from the war occur. And so just as the typologic system I earlier described, the short one, looks back to Moses, the one in the ministry of the adult ministry of Jesus looks forward to an individual who comes as Jesus predicts, and comes with the destruction that Rome wrought upon the Jews in 66 to 73 AD. Now, in fact, the system of typology indicates that, just as the parallels look back to Moses, that actually it's looking to a Roman Caesar, Titus Flavius. Okay, so this individual is the person who fulfilled the prophecies that Jesus envisions, right? And this has been well understood, of course. But what has been missed is that Jesus's ministry has all these little clever links into the life of Titus and the military campaign of Titus, just as you had the clever links looking back to Moses. The clever links now are looking to the Roman Caesar, so that you can see the identity, the actual name of the individual that Jesus calls the Son of Man, and that this individual is Titus Flavius. Now, in Josephus, this concept that Titus is the Messiah is underscored by the historian himself, because Josephus says that what propelled the Jews to rebel in 66 was their belief in a coming Messiah, that there were prophecies in their scriptures that envisioned, a Messiah would come who would basically save Israel. This is what they believed. This is what Josephus claims propelled them to rebel. And Josephus then states that, the Jews were wrong, though, in thinking that the prophecies envisioned a Jewish individual. They envisioned the Flavian Caesar and the government of Vespasian that Titus is the heir to. So this is Josephus has the exact correct theological understanding of the future, that the Flavian Caesar is the actual Jewish Messiah. Now, what this means, among other things, is that the Gospels, even though they look like religious literature and have been used, of course, as the basis for religion, they aren't religious literature. What they really are is a vanity piece. This literature, this story of Jesus, was concocted to basically give to posterity the legacy that the Flavian Caesars had been able to become the God of the Jews, which was an enormous goal of the Caesars during the war. They actually would try to force Jews into calling them God or Lord by burning them, but the Jews are very stubborn; they wouldn't do it. So this was their solution: is to create, this cockamamie religion, as it can be described in my context, with this religious literature, which has this strange character, the Son of Man that Jesus envisions. Now, I'll just conclude this little rant with this: the people fail to understand how perfectly wired the ministry of Jesus to the Roman-Jewish war is. In fact, most Christians don't even really know much about the Roman-Jewish war. They don't really even understand that the prophecies Jesus is making is concerning the war. But here's a way that is a real simple way to understand that the ministry of Jesus was developed and wired to the war. Jesus is the Passover of the new covenant. This is how he described himself. All of the symbolism, or much of it, is developed around the idea that he is a human Passover lamb. Okay, he's deliberately set up. This isn't contested by scholarship because it's just too obvious. He is being established as a new Passover lamb. He talks about eating my flesh and drinking my blood. He's killed on the Passover. They touch him with hyssop. The instructions for the preparation of the sacrifice are applied to his body. So he's really well understood as the Passover the sacrifice of the new covenant, which in the first covenant, the old covenant, was the Passover lamb. So he is the human Passover lamb of the new covenant. All right, so he is crucified on Passover 33. All right, this is the easy to extrapolate date, looking just at the text and the Gospels. You can say, okay, so he dies around 33 on Passover, which is appropriate because he is the human Passover lamb. So he dies on Passover. See, it makes all perfect sense. It's kind of witty theological construction. But what people don't realize is that, remember, there is a 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. 40 years. This is an important number, 40, for Jews. And so Moses goes into the wilderness, and he has to go through 40 years of wandering before he gets ownership of the promised land of Judea. So the human Passover lamb of the new covenant, he dies on Passover 33, and then 40 years to the day, which is a little curious, 40 years to the day is the fall of Masada. This is the day that Rome takes possession of all of Israel. So you can see that someone back calculated the date of the human Passover lamb sacrifice from the war to create this perfect 40-year mirror between the new covenant and the old covenant. So this is Christianity at its foundation. It's constructed by Rome. It is I think that the literature does have a political purpose. It's not just legacy vanity. They do want the character of Jesus Christ to become widely known because he promotes social kind of cooperation with the authorities, and he instructs Jews not to rebel. So, this is the kind of propaganda aspect of this new religion. But they could have done that, very simply. The real reason for the creation of the literature, if you read my book, Caesar's Messiah, there's a lot of complicated puzzles and there's some historical analysis, but all you really have to do is just read the chapter called The Flavian Signature. And in that chapter, I just take one gospel. I don't jump around because I don't want to confuse people. So I just take one gospel, Luke, and I just lay the text side by side, just lay them side by side. So anyone can see that the text in the Gospels is definitely dependent upon these parallels are too obvious, they're too vivid, they're too, unlikely to be circumstantial. That the entire ministry of Jesus has to be developed from the war because the events in the Gospels are occurring in the exact same sequence as the ones in Luke. So, people have tried to contest my theory, and there are different ways they can attack it. But ultimately, when you can simply lay the text side by side and then appeal to the reader's sense of reason, just say, look, here you go. And bearing in mind, like some of the criticisms are parallel mania, that I'm seeing things that aren't there, just I'm making stuff up. So what I do is I say, fine, look, I'm going to give you parallels which other scholars saw long before me, or things which are the exact same event, like Jesus envisions encircling Jerusalem with a wall. I look at this is a historical event. Here's the historical event. Josephus records it. Look at where it occurs in the sequence. And when you do that, when you just take all of the vivid parallels that other scholars have noticed and written about, and merge them with the historical events, but there's no way anyone can contest, you end up with like 80% of what I posit, and more than enough to see that, wait a second, one story is definitely based on the other. And because it hasn't been noticed, this obvious fact hasn't been noticed, you can see that I'm really on good grounds here, because this is at the very least, is the greatest oversight, just catastrophic failure of human intellect in history. No one has ever no literature has ever been picked over more than the Gospels, and except perhaps the history of Josephus. And the fact that no one has ever tried to do this little exercise that I propose and demonstrate is really just a tragic oversight. And it has to do with the fact that the religion was so powerful, the faith developed to such an extent that people's minds were just trained to not see it. So anyway, that is the story of Caesar's Messiah.
Cool. I mean, man, there's so many questions at this point. And, for people who, I can put myself in the shoes of people who've never heard of you, because I was there, like a couple of weeks ago. Without visuals here, to try to visualize what you're talking about in terms of chronology and these parallels, maybe let me ask you, what was the time frame that the Flavians were constructing these narratives and these parallel writings? When were they actually doing this?
Would have been between 80 and 100 CE. They would have, some of the stuff that's inside the Gospels, you can kind of see when the Flavians would have been developing it based upon their own history. In other words, there were 3 Caesars. This is the basis for the Trinity, incidentally. This is why you have the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. I think that the time that the first versions of the Gospels would have been produced would have been when Vespasian had died. He was the first Flavian Caesar. He died, and they went to the Senate to try to have him deified. This was a habit of Roman imperial politics, is that you would get a deceased Caesar made into a god. All right. And this is very important politically. I won't go into the Flavians, specific political problems, but just in general, they were a new imperial family. They didn't replace the Julio-Claudians. So it was very important for them to hook up to the imperial cult and have themselves deified as God. So they wouldn't be seen as inferior to the Julio-Claudian line that they'd replace. So when Vespasian died around 80, they went to the Senate and they were going to make the case that Vespasian was a god, and they would have brought the events of his life as examples. And so at this point, I think you get some of the stories developed about, Titus or of Jesus Christ, and he's there with God the Father. And this would have been the beginning of the theologic construction, of like God the Father, the Son of God, who is Titus, who was there doing this campaign. He's the one who actually ends up the Son of Man, being the Flavian that fulfills Jesus's prophecy, because Vespasian, his father, had to go back to Rome to take over the throne. And then you have this weird character, the Holy Spirit, right? That is the third Flavian Caesar, Domitian. He is kind of in and out of the story. It only is represented spiritually or in their memory, or this is because Domitian didn't participate in the war. So he's just kind of a tacked on event. But this is how the theology of Christianity developed. It's just representing the three Flavian Caesars. I think that as you got toward the year 100, the interest in the political aspect of Christianity would have been becoming much greater, because you're now only just about a little more than a decade away from the Kittos rebellion. The Jews had three distinct rebellions against the Roman Empire. You have the famous one in 66-73, where the temple is destroyed, and of course most people know about the Bar Kokhba rebellion, 133. All right, that led to the diaspora. A lot of people don't know about the one that occurred early in the second century, the Kittos rebellion, which was an absolute bloodbath. This was horrific. The Jews gained control of Cyprus and genocided every Gentile on the island. Okay, this is the kind of level of hatred and carnage, that the war produced. And it was really just an existential threat to the Roman Empire. There's actually a letter that had been uncovered by the Roman magistrate of Egypt fleeing down the Nile. He was fleeing south to get away from the Jews who had taken over control of Alexandria and the surrounding areas, which were the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. So this was not just some kind of trivial uprising. I mean, this was a struggle between great military powers. And I think that Christianity would have had a more urgent sort of interest on the part of the imperial family in Rome as you got toward this event, because they would certainly be well aware that the Jews were preparing to have this rebellion. So Christianity was, as I said, it's primarily just a legacy vanity structure. It's really, if you think about it, it's simply one of the imperial cult religions. Think of the imperial cult, which is the largest bureaucracy in the Roman Empire through this entire era. All of the Flavians had made themselves eventually gods and were, became part of the imperial cult. Christianity is just the Jewish version of the imperial cult. It's primarily just a way to represent Caesar as God. There's a little hocus pocus, because they don't name the individual that Jesus is looking forward to. That's for the, people who are cognoscenti and read the inside, kind of meaning of the Gospels. But there was a political purpose for the religion too, which is self-evident. It's just they're trying to tone down the Messianic movement, because like Josephus pointed out, it was the Messianic prophecies that were propelling Jews to rebel. So these rebellions could be seen as messianic, which is really not a particularly meaningful term, and because it just really means the king of the Jews. Obviously they would have had, the Jews would have had some kind of noble structure that would have led the rebellion, and that individual would have, because they were religious Jews, would have claimed the kind of religious mantle that the kings of the Jews would attest. In other words, they would represent themselves as from the line of David, and would claim a kind of a direct relationship to God because of this. In fact, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, by original interest, you could see that they were looking into the Old Testament, into the Torah, for signs to try to predict the future with. In other words, they were trying to create parallel patterns from the events described in the Torah, like the Habakkuk Pesher. These Peshers were looking forward to a time when there would be a messianic revival. So this was, that's what Josephus is referring to when he said that the messianic prophecies were what propelled them. And then this is why, you end up with a Jesus Christ, this pro-Roman, really bizarre character, ahistorical character, if you think of him in terms of the era and the religion. But when you think of him as coming from Rome, he's perfectly logical and almost, is to be expected.
Yeah, it's funny because, a lot of Christians nowadays, they have a tendency to see Jesus as this kind of upstart, underdog, anti-establishment sort of character. But you're saying something completely different, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, he's not. I mean, he was crucified. So this is, he's an underdog. But again, this is the reason he's crucified. I mean, you have kind of this hocus pocus theology that's associated with it. And of course, it's been massively expanded by Christian theologians as the religion moves through time. But ultimately, all you're really seeing is the sacrifice of the new Passover lamb. This is what is being represented is the new covenant being established. So you have the old covenant with the sacrifice of a real lamb to start off the 40-year cycle, and now with Christianity you have a human who is representing this, but it's all being done just to create the new cycle, the new 40-year process to develop a new covenant. They're trying to give people who are looking at the literature the impression that the old covenant is dead. God and the Jews are no longer fused. And in fact, this prophet, this Jesus Christ, has created a new covenant. And this is one that just conveniently is run by the Roman Empire. A few little historical bonbons that are amusing. The Pope, who is Jesus's representative, has the title of Pontiff Maximus, and this is in fact a title that Caesar held. This would indicate he is the head of the Roman College of Priests. So the Pontiff Maximus is historically Caesar. And then the one that I always find the most amusing is that you have the Vatican, which has the huge St. Peter's, this giant palace kind of thing. And it has that huge square. It's a giant open area that has an obelisk in the center of it. Well, what's kind of funny is that is literally the Flavian Circus. I mean, they didn't even move it. The Flavian Circus, which is where the chariot races were held, were done in that giant area with an obelisk right in the middle of it. And then their residence was directly adjacent. So you can see the Pontiff Maximus of the Christian religion didn't even change titles or move. They just stayed put, and then just declared it something that was being overseen by the relationship to Jesus Christ.
It's unbelievable when you put it like that. So I want to, for people, I think it's useful to, you've got this kind of like 3-stage kind of chronology here. And, we've got the Moses, the Jesus phase, and then the Titus phase. And essentially what you're saying is something like the Flavians were looking back through time. They were they were working from the Old Testament material, the Moses typology. And then they were essentially fabricating this savior figure, this Messiah, based on that pattern and the chronology. But they were also, at the same time, they were using this character to presage their own, dynasty and their own activities and this sort of stuff. I think it's really, and hopefully I've got that kind of on the money. And correct me if anything's kind of distorted there, but I would like to kind of see if we can pull on that thread a little bit of how they took the Moses typology, and we ended up, they were working backwards to create this midpoint. The chronology and the characters involved I feel like we need to maybe clarify this in terms of, can you comment more on the Flavian approach?
Sure. I mean, let me just
to
run
this?
through a few, and I'll give I can do this in my head because I have been familiar with, but I'll help the reader by giving some citations. So that's easy to do. It's not hard. You don't have to. Okay, so they probably don't have copy of Josephus. It'd be hard, but everyone could get the New Testament. Okay, so you look at like Luke 4, Nazareth, right? Well, where does that location come from? Well, if you go to Josephus, the history of Titus, book 3, chapter 7, line 304, you'll see that's where he bivouacs. This is where Titus actually sets up his little camp. Jesus then, he goes up to the brow of the hill. The Jews try to push him over, but they can't, and he goes right through them. Well, if you read the story, what Titus does, he goes up to he breaks through their defenses in the city, and then he passes through the town. I mean, he slaughters everybody. So you can see there's kind of this rough typological linkage. The town Nazareth, the name of it is given in Luke, but is only understood in it's not, Josephus doesn't have it, the name of the town. The fact that the ancient Catholic sort of archaeologists like Helena, who is Constantine's mother, saw this as the location, can only come from the fact that they know that this was where Titus begins his campaign. I mean, Judea is a huge place, and yet they found exactly the right spot to locate it, basically through the physical kind of outline of Titus's campaign. Luke 5, you have the famous thing at the Sea of Galilee where Jesus gathers his disciples and he says, from now on, you're going to be fishing for men. This would correspond to Wars 3, line 463. And that's where Titus comes to the same location, the Sea of Galilee, and he gets his men together and he says, don't be afraid. And they go out into the end of the sea, and they sink the Jewish ships, and they catch the men like fish. Okay, so this is, you can see there is a typologic link, even though it's sort of grim realism, but it's it's hard to miss. Now, there's other stuff, but some of them are complicated. At a certain point, you go, you travel from, Jesus says, we're gonna go to Jerusalem. Titus tells his troops, we're going to go to Jerusalem. You're outside Jerusalem for a while. Jesus, for some reason, doesn't go in immediately. He goes to, he's outside, and you'll see if you go to Luke, like Luke 13:6, he talks about cutting down the fruit trees. He says if they don't bear good fruit, we cut them down. Titus comes there, Wars 5:3, book 3. He says, we got to cut these fruit trees down. We're going to make some scaffolding for the wall assault. So cutting down the fruit trees. You have the triumphant entrance, Luke 19. This one's a little complicated, but you actually have verbatim passages that go back and forth between the description of Titus's entrance and the entrance at Luke 19. Titus's entrance occurs at Wars 5:6. Then Jesus says, we're going to encircle with a wall, Luke 19:45. Josephus records at Wars 5, book 7, that Titus actually does encircle Jerusalem with a wall. Luke 22:39, you're on the Mount of Olives, you capture somebody, and you take him away. He's going to get crucified. They don't say he's going to get crucified, but he's regarded, he's kind of a leader sort of person from a very well-known family. They say they capture him on Mount of Olives. You're back on the Mount of Olives with Josephus. Excuse me, that was Luke. Well, in Josephus, you go to the Mount of Olives, same place. They capture someone. There's some punning going on about they're going to crucify the guy. But then you go outside of Jerusalem now. Now, this is like really a lot of people wonder, well, if I just have to look at one parallel, I mean, I know you have all the historical things, but what is like the one parallel? So I don't have to waste a lot of time. Well, there's a story in Wars that occurs in the correct time in terms of the chronology, and in the story, you have three people being crucified, and then Josephus comes and he goes, "I want to take these guys down," and one of them amazingly survives. So it's very much very suspicious that you have one surviving out of a group of three. But if you look deeper into the story, you can see that there is just an incredible oversight and scholarship. Is that the actual name of Josephus is Joseph Bar Matthias, and then in Luke you have Joseph Arimathea. And if you actually lay the Greek out, it's just two different letters. And remember, like I was saying, it's not verbatimism, but you got 90% of the name of the parallel between the guys who asked, and it's the Roman commander that Josephus asked to take down from the cross. And the story is just too many moving parts. It's it is actually taken on just that the three crucified, one survives. If readers or listeners want to get into this, you can just Google it and you'll see that this is all by itself has taken on a life, that this parallel, there's lots of websites that are just dedicated to studying it, and people who pick it over can realize, they go, yeah, this is definitely something going on. This one story looks dependent on the other. And then the most important part, well, one of the most important part is that the story in the Gospels occurs at the end toward the end of the campaign. Well, it's the same place over in Josephus. You see what I mean? In other words, the sequence creates a kind of improbability for any possibility of it being an accidental connection. I mean, there's just too many moving parts. It's occurring at the correct point. So you just have to, at a certain point, lay down the idea that this is circumstance, because there's simply too many historical events and too many parallel sort of conceptual events, and the sequence is too long. At a certain point, that's why the book has been so popular, is because really it's the only book that has real evidence. In other words, there's like mythicism. People talk about there's a prior Jesus community that developed something called Q. There are different theories about how the literature came into existence, but it's all conjecture. There's, of course, no evidence of a prior Jesus community or of a document. There's no physical evidence of Q. They just extrapolate that these things had to exist, because that's how their theories hold together. But here, when you just take one text and lie it down next to the other, and it is the existing text, that's it. If you show dependency, then you have solved all the problems. And I would just say a normal, good reader will have no trouble whatsoever going through it and just saying, yeah, this is correct. This was how the adult ministry of Jesus was developed. And and bear in mind that when I posit this, when I say, look, this is how the ministry of Jesus is in existence, I have another thing which critics really do need to contemplate a little bit, in that I am not changing genres. If I was inventing the genre, if I was saying, I see this parallelism and I can kind of make sense out of it in a certain way, okay. I mean, I would say, there would be legitimate criticism on the grounds that this, perhaps is far-fetched because it's original. But I'm not. The system I showed you, the original, parallel system of the Jesus Moses, is well understood by scholars. Nobody contests it. They know what it means. And because it has no controversy associated with it, they all can accept it very easily. So the actual typologic system that I'm positing goes forward is one that does exist in the Gospels. So I would say that this is just about as strong of an interpretive framework as is possible. And it really should have been, at the very least, this should have been understood and have been put juxtaposed to the idea of historicity. This should have been, meat and potatoes to New Testament scholarship hundreds of years ago. And this should have been given to individuals as a possible way of understanding this literature, because it's so simple, so straightforward, and that would have led us out of the confusion of Christianity, quite a bit earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I was reading on your blog yesterday, I was doing a bit of background, and I read a few articles. One of the things that you did talk about was this kind of intentional. It was like the Flavians intentionally made it such that eventually people would notice the ruse or the game that they were playing as such.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about that?
Well, I mean, the thing that most, if you drive around Rome, the ancient structures, that were created by the Caesars, they're vanity pieces. And there's something they have, famous thing called the Arch of Titus. Okay, it's the Arch of Titus. It's across from the Colosseum. And on it, it has the statement, the God Vespasian and the Son of God Titus. Okay, now the events that are being depicted on the arch are the same events that Jesus was envisioning as associated with the Son of Man. So the vanity that created the Arch of Titus, right, is the same force that is creating the Gospels. It's easy now. On the arch, it's overt, but here they simply hid it and wanted people to see it in the future, but they put it there. They put the typology in that I show is a big deal, but they couldn't have done this overnight. This would have been a lot of work to have created three different, the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to put the typology in these Gospels. A lot of work. But what's driving it, the energizing principle, is the vanity of the Caesars. So this is why it was hidden, because they want the religion to work, but it's also why ultimately it can be seen, because they wanted to have their legacy understood by posterity. They thought, which is amazing when you think about it, they thought that we would look at this and see them in a favorable light. They thought that in the future, people would look at this, about them creating this false religion, and would be impressed and give them a positive historical legacy because of it. So this gives you an insight into the, kind of the mindset of the Caesars, how Machiavellian they were. And it also, I think, but in fact, I think that they'll get a very negative legacy at this point. But the legacy that's really important is that even 2,000 years ago, the government is involved in social control, false narratives, story of Jesus, for the purpose of social control, which means the ossification of their power. Okay, so today, I believe that the lessons learned from Christianity are well applied. I would think that at this point, you can see that the government is interested in social control through propaganda, and they are not the friends often of the citizen. They have malevolent purposes that are known to them and for their self-interest against the people. Mm-hmm. And so I would think that the modern Christianity, the neo-Christianity that to create an expression that the Caesar's Messiah might eventually create, would be kind of an anti-Christianity, in which instead of accepting the narratives that government give us, we would be just the opposite. Is that we don't believe anything you say to us. We have to, every single claim you make, we are going to scrutinize, and we will develop more powerful tools of analysis and criticism, because we don't believe a single thing you say. Because of that, I would say, like, the COVID debacle would be a classic example of how a more alert citizenry, a more skeptical citizenry with better analytic tools, would never have gone along with the lockdowns or the mandates for the vaccines.
Completely. I completely agree. And it's kind of ironic that a lot of in the sort of, the truth movement, or what have you, whatever you want to call it, we have a significant Christian contingency who are very much standing against this sort of this tyranny and this deception and the manipulation, but they ironically do it in the name of Jesus.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Well, at this point, all roads lead away from Rome, to use an expression. Look, they are developing technology for our control. I mean, you look at the Twitter mess that Elon Musk points out about how they're using this technology to create, or to shut down criticism and to promote concepts that are beneficial to them. So the government really has some fancy technology. We, on the other hand, we don't want to take vaccines that are bad for us, or to permit ourselves to be locked down for diseases which really aren't dangerous. So we just have to fight back with our intellect. And the Christians, they have within their Christianity, they have the basis for skepticism about the intellectual power of men and of man's government as opposed to spiritual government. Well, this is a good starting point. I would hope that they don't lose what is good in Christianity. I hope they are able to retain and use that as an energizing principle to become more skeptical of the government of men, because so often it's being established in a way that's malevolent to the population who are supposed to be the subjects.
Completely. I completely agree. I'm glad we're on the same page with that. Joseph, I'm wondering, as far as the Jesus mythological sort of supernatural savior type stuff, the more paranormal or supernatural elements of that narrative, what have you sort of spent much time paying attention to that side of it, the supernatural aspects?
I have my own sort of understanding and also faith. I was raised a Catholic, and my family was religious. My uncle was a Monsignor. I really liked the Catholic priests that taught me when I was young. That meant my the zenith of my intellectual powers were certainly like the third grade. When I was with them and they were training me in reading and things. So I like Christianity, and I like the spiritual side of it. I advocate as spiritual, the basis for, particularly in our current moment, I'm sure you'll agree, at least to some extent, that this is correct, is that what really is human spirituality is the sharing of truth, and of which through logic and through reason. And we have I think our personalities are exaggerated and to some extent destructive, and this has been deliberately shaped by the oligarchs through pornography and through avarice, the idea of greed and things. They're able to manipulate humans very, very easily by picking at our weaker elements. And so we are isolated. You have in our current moment, I would say, you have like pornographic males and single moms, and and are also women that want to explore away from family and just into political and financial power, which there's nothing wrong with per se, but it is not a principle that can sustain biology. So you have to at least question it to some extent. But my point is that when we engage in reason, we are unified. The differences are not as great as what we share. And so when I think of like the future of religion, I would love to see it based more on the Socratic principle rather than contestation and debate. I would like to see spirituality based on the moment of sharing of logic, reason, and truth. In other words, when you're legitimately engaged in just trying to figure stuff out, if you have someone who's good at one thing and another person who's good at another, these aren't elements of contestation. It's not a battle. Everyone can contribute what they can, and if the human reason is in all of us engaged, you end up with us being able to have improvement in our thinking and in our understanding of self. And I think that moment of unification where there is everyone can agree, or at least is in the process of agreement, that the information that we have and the logic we have, the explanation we have, we are sharing and seeing as truth. And I think that process is really would have been, I think, more engaged in the religions before, the oligarchs took them over and started to manipulate them. And I would say, like, as an example of how far in the wrong direction you can go, look at like Helen Blavatsky or Aleister Crowley. These people are government agents. They aren't legitimate mystics. I mean, I can show you chapter and verse how they are developed as agents. They are part of, taking people into mysticism away from reason, away from the process I described. So that with Crowley and Blavatsky, you have absolutely real-time examples of how religion can be used to take us out of the context that is the real spirituality, which is where we're sharing one another's minds with one another through reason. That's the portal. It's not, the satanic masses and sex magic and all of the other nonsense. That's to take us away from being able to share with one another, you see. So that's my take on spirituality, is that the mystical side should be at the end of the process of the Socratic method, the end of the sharing of reason. That's where we'll get to kind of the sharing and understanding of spirit. The other directions, the ones that come through pop culture are just designed to take us away from it.
Mm. I find it interesting. Do you think it's just a coincidence that, if you look at the Jesus character as on a symbolical level, and his, so-called relationship with God, on a symbolical level, there's a lot of, esoterically accurate stuff there, if you can see it at that level. And that's what I've noticed over the years is whoever was writing this and creating this, seemed to have quite a lot of esoteric insight. I don't know if that was serendipity or, do you have any thoughts around that?
Well, it's correct. They did. They knew exactly how to create the character. And you just have to remember two things. One is the imperial cult and even the mystery religions would have been under the control to some extent of the imperial family. And so they would have had to have developed these techniques to a very high level. So when you see Christianity, you're looking at, when Jesus is having his, existential experience, and, he's bleeding, because he's so distressed. There's a lot of knowledge of how to create this kind of religion that the imperial family is applying against the public. And then the other thing, which is a little harder to understand, is that a lot of what we see as legitimate kind of esoteric spirituality, we believe that. We have it in our thought world because it has been developed historically by the oligarchs. That's how it got placed there. I think a good person to kind of study the literature of this, the two I gave are probably the best example, would be Blavatsky, The Secret Doctrine, and then Crowley's like ludicrous sex magic stuff. That stuff is developed as propaganda and mind control. Very sophisticated, but it is in fact there.
This concludes part 1 of the show. You'll find part 2 and related materials in my members-only portal, the Truthiversity, the Consciousness Raising University. This creation is the official home for all my multimedia research and entertainment content. Updated regularly, my members get access to absolutely everything I create, including full podcasts, videos, blogs, courses, audio files, live internal events, the whole enchilada. Grab yourself a free 24-hour pass at access.truthiversity.com.